hear me, all of you? Am I audible to everyone?
Yes,
Please
sir.
let me know.
Yes, yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are audible.
Is the sound clear? Absolutely clear.
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, since I have only half an hour to speak, and I'm not sure if I too will be interrupted, as Anshuman was a while ago, I'll get to business straight away. And I'll make this presentation. Just let me know if the presentation is appearing on your screens. But first, before I do that, let me thank Onda Mahabidalaya for having so kindly asked me to make this presentation. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the participants who are here. And I hope that we can have some interaction, time permitting and technology permitting, at the end of whatever I have to say to you.
Yes,
all
sir.
right. Now just let me know if the presentation is appearing on screen. Just give me a while.
No, sir. Now the presentation is not.
I've not yet started it.
Okay, sir.
Yes, now? Hello?
No, 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 sir.
Not yet?
No, sir.
No.
Just give me a moment. All right, give me a moment.
Yes, sir.
Hello?
Hello?
Has it appeared now?
Yes, sir.
No, sir.
Yes?
Yes.
No, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
No.
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Now it appears.
Please pin Dr. Subhajit Sengupta's wall.
Yes. Can you see the first slide? Is it there on the screen?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right. So,
yes, go on full screen mode.
Full
screen mode.
All right. Then give me another minute. Is anything appearing on the screen?
No, sir.
No, sir.
So it appeared and disappeared just a while ago, but now nothing is appearing.
All right. This, I think, has more to do with the weaknesses of technology than with my disability to get it on the screen.
If full screen is not available,
what about now?
It is.
Yes, sir. It has appeared.
Yes, sir.
It has appeared?
It is coming.
Can you see it on the screen now?
Yes, sir.
All right. So in that case, I'll proceed. Are you sure it's all right? All right.
Sir, it disappeared once again.
Yes, sir.
Is it there? I can't see.
Is it there on the screen now?
Yes, sir. We can. Yes, sir. We can see. We can see it
all right. So
clearly.
Okay. Now the title of this presentation is Wonderful Year: The Plague of 1603 and Early Stuart Literature. Now, why should this year, 1603, be called a wonderful year? Now, in the course of this presentation, I'll, of course, make it clear to you why it is the wonderful year that we are calling it. In fact, the first person to call the year wonderful was Thomas Dekker in a pamphlet which he wrote, and the pamphlet was called The Wonderful Year. I'll come to that. But there were three very significant things that happened in 1603, and that is primarily what I'm going to focus on. And I'll talk about these three things, and particularly the plague of 1603. The first important thing to happen in 1603 was the death of Queen Elizabeth I, and then, of course, the rise to the throne of the first Stuart monarch, James I, who was also James VI in Scotland, and finally, very shortly after James became king, in fact, his coronation had to be postponed. There was another outbreak of the deadly plague, one in a series of several such outbreaks in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, the first great plague was, of course, the 1348 plague, called the Black Death of 1348. And the last of these probably was the Great Plague of 1665. But between 1348 and 1665, there were nearly 40 plagues in London. And most experts believe that the plague that struck London from the early part of the 14th century to the late 17th century was the Bubonic Plague, which was a disease caused primarily by black rats and other rodents. But at that time, no one knew that the disease was caused by rats. And there were all kinds of theories being forwarded regarding the cause of the disease. And some assumed that the disease was airborne. And there's a reference in Shakespeare's King Lear to the plague being airborne. We'll come to that towards the end of this presentation. And it was only much, much later, towards the 19th century, probably, that it was discovered that the plague had been caused by black rats and other rodents, and passed between the black rats, a particular species of rats, by flea bites. And when a rat dies from the plague, the fleas must find a new host to live on, and if that host happens to be a human being, the disease can then spread to humans. And that is precisely what was happening for over 400 years in English history. And the most common symptoms of this kind of plague, called the bubonic plague, would be headaches, fever, vomiting, painful swellings on the neck, armpits and groin, and blisters, all kinds of bruises on the body, and people would cough up blood. So you can understand the extent of the suffering that people would undergo if one were struck by the plague. During Shakespeare's lifetime, remember that Shakespeare was born in 1564 and lived till 1616, and the plague outbreaks in 1563, there was an outbreak which started just the year before Shakespeare's birth and reached terrible proportions in the year in which Shakespeare was born, 1564. And this was the plague of 1563, but it went on for a few years beyond 1563. And the plague outbreaks in 1563 and 1603 during Shakespeare's lifetime were the most lethal. And each of these plague outbreaks wiped out over a fourth of London's population. But plague was not the only disease in Shakespeare's time. There were a few others as well. And if you look at Shakespeare's plays and the plays of his contemporaries, there are frequent references to these diseases. There was smallpox, for example, which was hinted at in a reference to smallpox in the first quarter of Romeo and Juliet, which interestingly in the folio edition of 1623 was changed to plague. Now, it's difficult to ascertain the reason for this change, but we'll talk about it a little later. And there was syphilis and typhus and malaria. Now, malaria was also called the ague. And if you look at Shakespeare's texts, you will find a number of references to the ague. There's a reference to ague towards the end of Macbeth. And there's, of course, the most famous reference to ague in Twelfth Night, where one of the characters is called Ague Cheek because his cheeks are sunken, as would be the cheeks of a person afflicted with malaria or ague. In fact, ague was perhaps a particular kind of malaria which would cause the cheeks to get a little hollow and sink. And in fact, even James I had a very mild attack of ague. 1603 in Shakespeare's England, very significant year. Now, there have been books written on specific years. during Shakespeare's lifetime, years which were significant, either for Shakespeare himself or for the London of his time, or for the theatre, the evolution of the theatre. For example, James Shapiro is the author of two best-selling books, which the Oxfordians have described as very speculative, rather unkindly. And one of these is 1599, a book called 1599, which is primarily about the building of the Globe Theatre that year. And another is called 1606, the year of Lear. But of course, 1603 was also a very important year, and I'm not sure if Shapiro is planning to write a book on 1603 as well. Now, 1603 has been described, as I said at the start, by Thomas Dekker as wonderful year in what turned out to be a best-selling pamphlet. On the 24th of March, Elizabeth I died, and in the absence of an heir, King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England. And shortly thereafter, there was this outbreak of plague, claiming around a quarter of London's population, and it swept not only through the big city of London, but also through the surrounding countryside, including the place of Shakespeare's birth, Stratford-upon-Avon. And James I, very quickly on becoming King of England, issued a book of orders. It was called Orders, and the next slide will show you the title page. And this was related to the plague outbreak. And there's a very good copy of this book in the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust Library in Stratford-upon-Avon. And the full title of this book was Orders Thought Meet, that is, thought appropriate, by His Majesty and His Privy Council, to be executed throughout the counties of this realm, to be executed throughout the counties of this realm, in such towns, villages, and other places as are or may be hereafter infected with the plague, for the stay of further increase of the same. So obviously, it was a series of orders aimed at controlling the plague and restricting its further spread. Now, the first half of this book speaks of these orders, speaks of the orders enforced to control the plague in and around London. For example, people were being asked to stay indoors and quarantine themselves. And this is followed in the second half by mentions of several medicines and cures, preventive and remedial cures, recommended not quite by James I himself, but by physicians. And James I accumulates those recommendations and prescriptions and makes them part of the contents of this book called Orders, thereby providing a very useful insight into early modern medical practices. And the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust website, if I remember correctly, has the text of this book, not a facsimile, but a printed text, and also gives you the list of contents of James I's orders. Now, some of these remedial cures are interesting. For example, the physicians whose recommendations are brought together in this book suggest the correcting of the humors that Ben Jonson spoke of and made use of in his plays. Those humors had to be corrected through purging and bloodletting. Secondly, there is the recommendation that there is a recommendation to make use of herbal remedies. Pregnant women were advised to eat toast covered in vinegar, butter, and cinnamon. The poor were told, since the poor couldn't always afford toast and vinegar and butter and cinnamon, they were told that they, and I'm quoting, may eat bread and butter alone, without the vinegar and without the cinnamon. And if they couldn't toast the bread, they could eat it as they had it from the market. And butter was seen as a preservative against the plague. And those already suffering from plague sores, that is before they had laid their hands upon this book and had come to know of these cures and remedies, they too could cure themselves with a warmed mixture of onions, butter, and garlic. And if there were any who couldn't afford even that, and some were terribly poor in Shakespeare's England, one could simply lay, as the text says, a load of bread to it, that is to the sore. So a bit of bread had to be applied to the sore, hot as it cometh out of the oven. Now, people actually believed in these cures. Medical science was at a very early stage of development. And of course, today, though we may really brush these recommendations and remedies aside as pure gibberish and nonsense, people in those times, including the King of England, actually believed in these cures. Mind you, they formed the contents of a book authored by the king himself. Now, while going out of doors, people were advised to hold herbs in their hands or drape a handkerchief around their mouths, which had been mouths and nostrils, which had been previously dipped in vinegar. And this is some sort of a precursor to today's medical face masks that we are talking about so frequently. And this is an interesting picture. And to the right, you have Shakespeare, and between Shakespeare and the figure on the left, you have a portrait of James I. But the interesting part of this picture, obviously, is the figure on the left. And he is a plague doctor. And the clothing worn by plague doctors is some sort of an early primitive version of the PPEs, which are in such short supply today. And this clothing was intended to protect the plague doctors from airborne diseases and was introduced around 1619, of course, much after 1603, the year that we're talking about. And it was believed that the plague was possibly an airborne disease. And so this sort of clothing was meant to protect the plague doctors from airborne diseases. But the beak shape around the nose was already prevalent in 1603. And it was stuffed with aromatic herbs, such as lavender. People who walked out into the streets were advised to carry herbs in the palms of their hands. And the doctors stuffed the beak that they had upon their noses with aromatic herbs. Lavender was frequently used. Now, this brings me to another important book, the one that I mentioned a while ago, Thomas Dekker's The Wonderful Year, which also, like James's book, was published in 1603. And let's see what the title page says. It was printed in London, printed by Thomas Creed, but that's not the most important part of it. It's towards the top. The Wonderful Year, 1603. Wherein is showed the picture of London lying sick of the plague. But of course, there was something happy about 1603 as well, the rise to the throne of James I. And Dekker writes about that as well. But he initially writes about Elizabeth's death. And look at what he has to write about the moment of her passing away. It was as if she were commanding, she who had commanded the court of humans in England was now subject to the command of the heavens and was responding to the summons issued from above. Let's quickly pass through this because the main subject of our discussion is the plague, but I'll just ask you to take a look at what Dekker has to write about Elizabeth's death. This is only a small portion of what he writes in the book. The summons made her start. Of course, he's imagining this because he was not anywhere close to the dying queen, but he imagines that there was a summons from heaven, and the summons, sorry, it's misspelled in the slide. That was an inadvertent error. Summons, S-U-M-M-O-N-S. The summons made her start. It surprised her. But having an invincible spirit did not amaze her. Yet whom would not the certain news of parting from a kingdom amaze? But she knew where to find a richer. That is, she knew where to find a richer kingdom than the one that she had been ruling in England, and that was in heaven, and therefore lightly regarded the loss of this. And she didn't make much fuss over the loss of her earthly kingdom when she heard the summons from heaven, and therefore lightly regarded the loss of this, and thereupon made ready for that heavenly coronation being, which was most strange, most dutiful to obey, that had so many years so powerfully commanded. That is, this queen, who had for so many years so powerfully commanded the people on the earth, her subjects, was now most dutiful in obeying the commands of heaven. She obeyed death's messenger and yielded her body to the hands of death himself. She dies, resigning her scepter to posterity and her soul to immortality. And then he writes, Dekker, of the coming of James I. For behold, up rises a comfortable sun out of the north, whose glorious beams like a fan dispersed all thick and contagious clouds. The loss of a queen was paid with the double interest of a king and queen. Now, Elizabeth, of course, didn't have a husband. She was referred to as the Virgin Queen, and she left no heir to the throne. And the loss of a queen, Dekker says, was paid with the double interest, because James not only became King of England, but he also brought with him to England his Danish queen. And as I said a little while ago, there was an outbreak of plague, the 1603 plague, shortly thereafter. And in fact, James I's coronation had also to be postponed because of that outbreak. Just a moment. Now, Dekker then goes on to write on the plague of 1603, and see what he writes. A stiff and freezing horror sucks up the rivers of my blood. My hair stands an end with the panting of my brains. Mine eyeballs are ready to start out, being beaten with the billows of my tears. I'm not sure if Shakespeare knew these lines, but he was writing something very similar, making use of very similar images in Macbeth, which was written around 3 years later, possibly during the 1606 plague. And in an aside that Macbeth speaks soon after he gets the news that he has been made the Thane of Cawdor, he talks about his hair standing on end as he contemplates the murder of Duncan to become the king and bring to full fruition the prophecy of the third witch. And then much later in the play, when the witches show him a line of kings, all of them Banquo's descendants, he sees them with crowns on their heads and addresses one of them, saying, "Thy crown does sear mine eyeballs." So possibly Shakespeare might have had Dekker's lines in mind. Shakespeare was too much of a genius, really, to always have the need to go back to authors of the past for images. Now, a stiff and freezing horror sucks up the rivers of my blood. My hair stands an end with the panting of my brains. Mine eyeballs are ready to start out, being beaten with the billows of my tears. Out of my weeping pen does the ink mournfully and more bitterly than gall drop on the pale-faced paper. Even when I do but think how the bowels of my sick country have been torn, Apollo, therefore, and you bewitching silver-tongued muses, get you gone. Invocate none of your names. Sorrow and truth sit you on each side of me, whilst I am delivered of this deadly burden. Prompt me that I may utter ruthful and passionate condolement. Arm my trembling hand, that it may boldly rip up and anatomize the ulcerous body of this anthropophagized plague. All right. So the plague is being, when it's called this anthropophagized plague, the plague is being imagined as some sort of a Scythian cannibal, which is devouring up humans so rapidly. But the Apollo that Dekker would want to depart, and the Apollo, therefore, and you bewitching silver-tongued muses, get you gone, is the mythological god of dance and music in this case. Now, Apollo was a mythological god of several things, including the arts, and particularly dance and music, and it's that which Dekker has in mind when he makes this reference to Apollo. Of course, later there's a reference to King James I also as Apollo, but then Apollo was also the classical mythological god of health and healing. And when James is referred to as Apollo, that is the connotation. All right. Now, Dekker continues, lend me art without any counterfeit shadowing. Let me be honest in my art, to paint and delineate to the life the whole story of this mortal and pestiferous battle. And you, the ghosts of these, more by many than 40,000, that is over 40,000 people had died when Dekker was writing this, that with the virulent poison of infection have been driven out of your earthly dwellings, you desolate hand-wringing widows that beat your bosoms over your departing husbands, you woefully distracted mothers that with disheveled hair fallen into swoons, you mothers who have fainted and have your hair disheveled, whilst you lie kissing the insensible cold lips of your breathless infants, you outcast and downtrodden orphans. And he goes on to talk about those woeful sights that met many Londoners' eyes in 1603. And Dekker, as I said, later goes on to invoke James as Apollo, but now Apollo with different connotations, as England's healing physician. And there's, again, in Macbeth, an oblique reference to this. Of course, it's the English king that is being referred to as a healing physician, and he's described as possessing the miraculous power of healing ulcerous sores, which were very common in persons afflicted with plague. There's no mention of plague directly there when the king's magical powers are being described, but we understand that this is an oblique reference to James I, and part of the exercise in flattery that Macbeth is, the play Macbeth is, of England's reigning monarch of the time. Now, the representation of James as England's healing physician may be interpreted as part of Jacobean propaganda to counter Catholic rumor. Mind you, this was Protestant England, and this could be part of a Jacobean propaganda to counter Catholic rumor that James's accession had brought the wrath of God on England, and therefore there has been this there had been this outbreak of plague in the very year in which James became king. Now, in later pamphlets, Dekker himself explained the epidemic of the plague as God's way. Now, this was part of something that I'll talk about a little later, how rhetoric, how writing could shape people's ideas about disease, even during the early modern period. And Dekker himself, in one of his later pamphlets, in fact, in a few of his later pamphlets, himself explained the plague epidemic as God's way of making England pay for the sins committed in the previous reign. He was referring to the reign of Elizabeth. And to, by sins possibly, he meant the frequent acts of treason against the Queen. Now, plague is also accorded in Dekker's book, The Wonderful Year, a regenerative role. It's not entirely bad. And what sort of regenerative role is accorded it? It is something that can get rid of sins, something that can purge society, purge London, purge England of the excess population which produced that other terrible scourge, the famine. It was necessary to reduce the population. The plague was helpful in doing this. There is a suggestion of this regenerative role of the plague in Dekker's work. And there was also possibly the need to help King James I recover from the embarrassment of having his kingship in England always associated with the outbreak of the 1603 plague. So something good had to be said about the plague. And so seeing the plague in a positive light, taking note of its regenerative role, was one of the ways in which James I's embarrassment could be neutralized, if I may use that word. Towards the end of this pamphlet, Dekker offers a very grave warning. Part of the book is in prose, part of it is in verse, and generally the portions which deal with the plague are in verse, and they take a very somber note. And 'tis now the beggar's plague, for none are in this battle overthrown but babes and poor. The lesser fly now in the spider's web doth fly. The lesser fly, the insect. The lesser fly means either the babies and the poor people, not the grown-up people, not the well-to-do people, but the babies and the poor, the lesser fly, now in this spider's web doth fly. The spider's web is a reference to the deadly clutches of death, the plague. But if that great and goodly swarm, the runaways, that has broke through, has run away, all right? Broke through, to break through something is to escape, and felt no harm, in his envenomed snares should fall. Even if those who have run away from the places most affected by plague, if they somehow should still fall within the venomous, poisonous snares of the plague, oh, pity to our most tragical, then that would be indeed very terrible. This is what, what Dekker is suggesting is that although on the surface of things, the plague has most terribly affected the babies and the poor people, those who have managed to get away from the areas most affected by the disease could still be in danger of being infected. Now, there was a person called Lucretius. Many of you have heard of his book, De Rerum Natura, translated into English as The Order of Things, and still available in print. The Penguin Black series publishes it. Now, this book was written during the politically turbulent Rome of the 1st century BC, and it argues, it's a very rational argument that Lucretius offers here. And in fact, in recent times, I think it was around 2012, probably, if I'm not very mistaken, could be a little earlier than that, Stephen Greenblatt wrote a book called The Swerve, subtitled The Birth of the Renaissance. Of course, it sold with a different title in the United States from the title with which it sold in the United Kingdom. And he won the Booker Prize for the book. Now, the book that Greenblatt wrote is primarily about the tremendous influence that Lucretius's book, De Rerum Natura, had in shaping Renaissance thought. Now, Lucretius wrote during the 1st century BC in Rome, and he argues that supernatural explanations of fearful occurrences such as earthquakes and thunderstorms and floods and plagues, were actually very powerful and potential tools in the hands of powerful priests, power-hungry priests, and politicians. Remember, if you have read Julius Caesar, the supernatural explanations that are suggested for the storm and the strange occurrences in nature before Caesar is assassinated. And then Cassius, I think it is, who tells Cinna to look for the true reason rather than believe in superstitions. But if you would consider the true cause, why all these gliding ghosts, etc., why these appear before our eyes, you will find that, and then there's an attempt to counter superstition with more rational explanations. And that passage, I think, that part of Julius Caesar is actually one where Shakespeare is probably going back to Lucretius. In fact, Lucretius's book was lost for several hundred years and was rediscovered only during the Renaissance. And it's suspected that it was deliberately kept hidden beneath the bricks in church walls because it was too radical. Lucretius attempted to neutralize the supposed horrors of the unknown by refuting supernatural explanations and offering rational explanations, or even natural in a very specific sense. Natural, which is to say scientific or explanations. Now, Lucretius knew that the way people explain and write about disease is important, since this sort of writing about disease, or a particular kind of rhetoric that's used to write about disease, not only records the perceptions of the writer, but can also have an influence upon people who read such writings, and can therefore shape the responses of readers, can shape social response in no small way. This leads me to a very brief discussion of rhetoric and the discourses of the plague. Writers who wrote about the plague, Decker, for example, and a few others, were, in a sense, owners of a certain kind of rhetoric. And we could talk about at length, not now, but some other time, of the rhetorical ownership of the explanations of disease, rhetorical ownership of the discourses of diseases such as the plague. The 16th and 17th century discourses of the plague reveal a complex interplay between religion, politics, and medicine. So much so that plagues and other diseases were not only associated with medicine and medical prescriptions and remedial cures, but also with politics and religion. And one of the ways in which this was done was through the emphasis that was laid on the idea of the plague being, and some other diseases too, being an expression of God's wrath and being God's punishment brought upon the earth for the sins committed by the people of the earth. Now, quoting from the biblical book of Samuel, Enoch Clapham wrote in 1603, "Famine, sword, and pestilence are a trinity of punishments prepared of the Lord." It's the Lord who has prepared this punishment for consuming a people, for the consumption of, that is. This is the English of 1603, but what he means is that this trinity of punishments has been prepared by God for the consumption of the people, or consumption by the people that have sinned against him. In the 16th century, phenomena such as famine, wars, and particularly civil wars and pestilence and other diseases were strategically and rhetorically constructed as God's scourges or God's punishments, his plagues, God's plagues, to punish a sinful people. And this continued well into the 18th century, even when Defoe wrote his Journal of the Plague Year, because the title of the Journal of the Plague Year, as we will discover, talks of visitation, the plague being a visitation, suggesting divine intervention, divine punishment. That's what's implied by visitation, a visitation by the divine. So God's hand was not totally removed from the equation, even as late as the 18th century. Now, let's come back to what we were talking about. Thomas Eliot wrote The Castle of Health in 1539. Now, this was much before 1603. And there also he talks about God's hand. "Moreover, receive not into your house any stuff that cometh out of a house wherein any person hath been infected." Now, this is clear. And then he goes on to say, "But there I always accept the power of God, which is wonderful and also merciful, above man's reason and counsel, preserving or striking whom, when, and where it shall like his majesty." His majesty, of course, is God. And God, according to his own judgment, decides whom to strike down and whom to preserve. There were penal sanctions, punishments for transgression, for those who would break rules, who would disobey orders, such as the ones that had been laid down in James I's book called Orders. But then it was being suggested that there would be both divine punishment and earthly punishment. Earthly punishment in the form of punishment by law, by the law of the land. And then, to add to that, there could also be divine punishment. In 1603, Robert Cecil warned people about the city's unruly infected, those who would not stay indoors in spite of the orders to do so, who would still move out of their houses and people the streets of London and the suburbs. And he argued in favor of sharper punishment to control these unruly people. In 1604, there was a policy that was put in place of isolating the infected and this was backed up by penal sanctions. Anyone with a plague sore found wandering outside could be whipped if he were alone and hanged if he were found in the company of people. Writers were encouraged to write about contagion and take measures. They were encouraged to write about contagion and to write about the measures to control contagion. A person called Manning wrote in 1604 that people who disobey the orders and infect other people by coming out of their houses were no better than murderers. And he wrote, may not they be condemned for murderers, which having plague sores will press into companies or willfully pollute the air or other means which others are made to use and live by. And
Dear sir, you are not clearly audible. Please.
Okay.
Check the technicalities.
Just 1 minute. No, my microphone is switched on.
I think Ashim, your network has some issue. We can,
yes.
We can clearly listen to him. No problem.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I'll take another 5 minutes, if that's okay with you.
Yes, sir.
Before we have another technological problem. All right.
Okay.
Now.
But you're audible now. But I think now you're perfectly audible.
I'm not speaking anything. I mean, when you said I was not audible, I was silent. Now, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, thank you. Now, in 1604, this is what Manning wrote, and Manning goes on to suggest that keeping the body under control was not only a civic obligation, but also a godly obligation, because it was God's wish that the body should be kept under control. That is what he goes on to write later. And failure to do this, failure to keep the body under control, that's staying indoors, keep the body within the walls of the house, would invite both divine retribution and civic punishment. Now, I'll refer you to a recent anthropologist from 1603 and the writers of 1603. Let us take a long leap and come down closer to our own time. And Mary Douglas is this anthropologist that I'm referring you to. And she argues in a book called Purity and Danger that the rhetoric of contagion and exclusion in writings on the plague, excluding people who were infected, talking about contagion and infection while discussing the plague, has not so much to do with the controlling of the disease, and this is a very significant point that Douglas is making, saying that it has not so much to do with controlling the disease as it has to do with the need to impose order on a chaotic and untidy and unruly society. And thereby, she is suggesting an inextricable link between the biological and the social. And she says, ideas about separating, purifying, demarcating, and punishing transgressions have as their main function to impose system on an inherently untidy experience. So the main function is to impose order, system on an experience, the experience of the towns in those days, the experience of early 17th century London, which was entirely chaotic and unruly. It is only by exaggerating the difference between within and without, above and below. That is, what's in the house and who is in the house and safe and who is outside and likely to infect others, above the social superiors and the commoners and below, etc., that a semblance of order is created. Now let's come finally to Shakespeare, and I'll refer you to some of his plays. But remember, there was an outbreak of plague in 1563, and as an infant born the next year, Shakespeare was very lucky to survive the disease, and Stratford-upon-Avon, the town of his birth, was ravaged by a huge outbreak in the summer of 1564, a few months after he was born. He was born in April, as you know. And up to a quarter of the town's population died. The population was not much, around 1,000 people. So around 250 died, including 4 children on the very street of his birthplace Henley Street, as it's called. In 1592, when he was beginning his career as a playwright, and a year before Christopher Marlowe's death, there was another outbreak that caused the theatres to close down temporarily. And since the theatres closed down, there was a reduction in the numbers of performances. And Shakespeare spent this time writing poetry. He began writing the sonnets, and he wrote Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. Shakespeare's own experiences of the plague do not find frequent expression in the plays. His real-life experiences of the plague are only very scantily and obliquely mentioned in the plays. Romeo and Juliet is important. It was written in 1595, soon after the 1592 plague. And here Shakespeare uses the plague to shape a crucial part of the plot. And an outbreak of the plague delays Friar Lawrence's messenger. And this means that Romeo does not come to know of Juliet's plan. And this sets into motion the chain of events that eventually leads to the deaths of the two lovers through a series of misunderstandings. And the messenger who has been delayed, now he recounts, the searchers of the town, the searchers, that's people who were searching for people infected with plague, suspecting that we both, the two messengers, that we both were in a house where the infectious pestilence did reign, sealed up the doors and would not let us forth. So there's a direct reference to people being searched and people being put inside houses. In Romeo and Juliet, we have also Mercutio's famous dying cry addressed to the two houses, the Capulet household and the Montague household. A plague on both your houses, he says. And in the first quarter version of the play, this was printed as pox, a pox on both your houses. But then such was the impact of the plague, probably, that was changed by the editors of the first folio into plague, or probably there could be some other reason. And Hemming and Condell, who were very close to Shakespeare, knew that Shakespeare had written plague and that pox was only an error by some unscrupulous actor who had reconstructed the play from memory, as was so often the case in the writing of the quarters. Now, after the outbreak of the 1603 plague, performances by Shakespeare's acting company, the name of which changed that very year from the Chamberlain's Men to the King's Men, performances became infrequent because of the plague of 1603. Measure for Measure, written sometime towards the end of 1603 and completed perhaps in early 1604, is set in a Vienna that is heavily afflicted with disease, both literal and metaphorical. And Shakespeare is indirectly depicting the London of his own time. Brothels and bars abruptly shut down by the government, as they were so often shut down in London. Timon of Athens culminates in a man sending himself into exile, and he keeps talking of the plague. Plagues, your potent and infectious fevers heap on Athens. And then he says at another point, be drowned with plagues. And then yet again he says, send them back, the plague. So there are these references to plagues in the plays that Shakespeare was writing around the time. Now, this is the last slide, and I'll conclude with references to two very popular tragedies. In Macbeth, which was possibly written during the 1606 plague, we have Ross's speech, where Ross is talking of Scotland suffering during Macbeth's reign. And the figure of Macbeth, the tyrant, is also a figure in some ways of the plague as tyrant. Macbeth is a plague so far as Scotland is concerned. And Ross describes to Macduff and Malcolm what's happening in Scotland when he reaches England. And he says, the dead man's knell is there scarce asked for who, and good men's lives expire before the flowers in their caps, dying or ere they sicken. Now this would have sent shivers down the spine of people in the audience. And James Shapiro, in his book 1606, The Year of Lear, this is the year, of course, in which Lear was first performed on Boxing Day, that's 26th of December, 1606. That was the first performance of King Lear. And Macbeth, too, was performed at the Blackfriars Theatre the same year. And James Shapiro notes, though less than 4 lines long, he's talking of this passage which I just quoted, there's probably not a better description of the terror and malaise plague carried with it. In King Lear, now there has been recently talk about King Lear having been written when Shakespeare was quarantined. Now, no one is very sure of that, and this has been circulating very frequently on social media. There was an article on this in a Bengali newspaper a few days back, but then this is very speculative. But yes, the kind of bleak world that we find in King Lear, which of course we know John Cott makes much of, and which Peter Brook makes much of. Peter Brook, of course, falls back on Jan Cott's essay on King Lear in his film of 1971 and sets the film in a barren landscape. Anyway, now that's another issue. We're talking about the plague, and I'll wind up very quickly. There are quite a few references to the plague in King Lear. And Kent, for example, curses Goneril's servant Orford, saying, "A plague upon your epileptic visage." And Lear talks about the plagues that hang in this pendulous air, life fated upon men's faults, he says. So Shakespeare, who's putting these words into Lear's mouth, is probably subscribing to the theory prevalent at that time that the plague was airborne. And Lear calls Goneril a plague sore, an embossed carbuncle in my corrupted blood. And towards the end of the play, when Lear brings in Cordelia's lifeless body onto the stage, he addresses those on the stage in terms that express his frustration and anger. And he says, "A plague upon you, murderers, traitors all. I might have saved her if I had been given the opportunity, and you were the ones responsible for her death. So a plague upon you." He's cursing the people on the stage. Of course, one could go on and on talking about the plague in Shakespeare's time, and one could talk of different ways in which to associate Shakespeare and his contemporary writers with the plague, and talk of the plague as a disease that made its way into a number of significant discourses in early modern England. But then we need to draw the line somewhere, and I believe that I've transgressed the limits imposed on the lecture. So thank you very much for being in the audience and listening to this, and I hand over charge of the webinar to the organizers.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to Dr. Subhajit for his valuable observations. Rather, we may call it a journey upwards. Now the floor is open for interactive session. If anyone who wants to ask any questions or give any observation on it, you may ask. But remember, you have to unmute your speaker and you may ask. Due to lack of time, one may ask only one questions, or you may text your questions at the chat box also. We will take questions from there also. Please.
Can I take the opportunity of asking Subhajit something? This is Amrit. Subhajit,
Yes, Amrit. Hello.
Hello. Subhajit, it was wonderful.
Thank you.
I hope students have seen how chiseled out your presentation was. But there's something which bothers me, and I think you will share this, that, the plague remained the most potent killer across almost a few centuries, right?
Yes.
Yet, given the volume of references to the plague or any literature that was directly associated with the plague, you mentioned, of course, Dekker.
Yes.
Dekker was probably the only person who was a literary figure who was writing about the plague, right? As a separate text, it remains very interesting that there was no representation of the actual disease. It comes always in oblique references. What is your take on this? Was it because there was a popular misconception that Now, if you wrote about the plague or if you represented the plague, one could perish? Or was it because, theater writers would not want to depict a disease which first meant that theaters would be closed? I would like to know your response to this.
Yes, Somri, thank you for that rather fascinating question. Yes, there are references, oblique references to the plague, Shakespeare, even in some of Ben Jonson's plays. But yes, Dekker was the only literary figure writing about the plague, and he has this full-length pamphlet, a major portion of which is about the plague. And this is non-fiction, mind you. There is no fiction, no poem, no full-length play that's devoted entirely to the plague. Now, there could not have been, I presume, any instruction from the authorities, either from the parliament or from the king, asking writers, poets and playwrights to abstain from writing about the plague. I don't think that could have been a possibility. I think it must have had something to do with superstition, have as little to do with the plague as possible. Even today, let me make an honest confession. I am very hesitant to talk about COVID-19. Of course, we do talk about COVID-19, but then if I were asked to represent COVID-19 in a painting or in a piece of creative writing, I would be hesitant to be too explicit. I think there's always a lurking fear to give expression, to give creative expression to something of which you are inherently very, very afraid. And that, I think, is responsible. Some degree of superstition might have also being responsible for the writers choosing not to write about the plague, fear of retribution. If you wrote about the plague, if you wrote a play whose subject would very clearly be the plague, that could incur God's wrath further. Because no one was very certain about the plague and about the consequences, what it would lead to, what were its causes. People were only speculating that God had a hand in it, and then no one knew the extent of God's hand and what would incur God's wrath further. So I think that's what kept writers away from it. But thank you for that question. I think I'll think deeper and harder on that.
Thank you.
Is there any question?
So can I say something regarding this?
Yes, may I know who's speaking, please?
Hello?
Yes, you can speak.
Yes. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, audible.
Yes, may I know who's speaking?
Yes, so I think earlier, as we go back, be it Elizabethan period or even before that, I think, the subject matter of art was selective compared to as you move on towards 19th century or, realistic art or modernism and later on. So I think, whatever is bleak and dark and very, very traumatic, even presentation of that thing, even if it is a natural phenomena or even if it is something related to human beings, morality, I think that was presented in a different way at that time. I mean, as you move back and as we move forward, the presentation becomes more and more explicit. I mean, this is what I had to say in connection with what you were just discussing.
All right, may I know who was speaking?
Sir, this is Momita.
Sorry? Okay, I'll respond to that. I think you're partly right. I'm not very sure of that because I hadn't thought this way before. Partly, I think you're right. You could be right. Remember what Feste sings towards the end of Twelfth Night. We'll strive to please you every day. So one of the purposes of drama was to please. And one couldn't really please people with a play on the stage that would have the plague or any other epidemic, any serious disease as its main subject. Of course, in plays, there are references to diseases. I think ague cheek is very significant in this respect, in Twelfth Night itself. But then he's part of the comic underplot. So even when there are these indirect references to the plague, they are either not dwelt upon at length, or they are lightly passed over. And sometimes, as in the case of ague cheek, maybe the tables are turned, so to speak, on the deadly quality of the diseases. And what we find is a kind of comic veil, so to speak, thrown upon that deadliness. I mean, that's my immediate response to the observation.
It's just one thing which I would like to add to what Momita said. This is not really true in terms of visual culture, where you have far more significant and graphic representations of disease, and especially the plague, the bubonic, the bubos, actually. But that is something which, yeah, that is something which is interesting that Momita suggests. And you suggested also that the first casualty of the plague would be the theater. I'm sure you probably have mentioned that the theaters could be opened only when there were no plague cases for consecutively 10 days. Only then would you actually have the theaters opening. But I was slightly more interested, since you mentioned Dekker, about the history of the reception of Dekker's text. He's being the only person who actually was a literary hack who was writing about the plague. What kind of reception did this text have?
No, if you are asking about whether people are happy to read about to read Dekker, I wouldn't be able to answer. They couldn't be happy reading about the plague. But then the pamphlet sold very well. It sold remarkably well. Part of the reason for that could be that it was not only about the plague, it was also about Elizabeth. It was that could be one reason this had happened. But I'm not sure if people were happy reading the book, the pamphlet. They must surely have been startled out of their zones of comfort when they turned to the pages on the plague, particularly where Dekker is being so graphic in talking about the weeping widows and the orphaned children. I read out a bit of that. And so far as visual culture goes, Amrit, I think there's always this discrepancy, this little bit of disagreement. And visual cultures have the potential to disturb recipients more. And in this context, I would speak of Nahum Tate's King Lear, which was performed in the 18th century, almost throughout the 18th century, where Cordelia doesn't die. At the same time, painters in England, at the same time as Nahum Tate's version was being put on stage, because Shakespeare's King Lear supposedly was unbearable to the audience, painters were painting scenes from Shakespeare's King Lear. And if you visit the Tate Britain Gallery in London, there's a huge canvas that shows painted sometime in the middle of the 18th, Cordelia's corpse. That last scene, Cordelia is dead. So as if Shakespeare's King Lear was annihilated from people's memory. But that's visual culture. Similar is, I think, the case with early modern plagues, because yes, these very graphic illustrations and paintings, but that's all toned down and made more pleasant within quotes, in the literary culture of the time.
Hello. Hello, sir. May I
Yes,
ask you one question? So I am
yes,
Shishpal from
please.
Palampur, Himachal Pradesh. Your lecture was really very wonderful.
Hello,
Hello,
I can't.
hello.
Sir, I would like to kindly
Yes, I'm
request
straining my ears since I can't catch your
everybody
voice.
to, put their microphones mute so we can hear clearly.
Hello. So your lecture was
Hello,
really
yes.
wonderful and pronunciation was really very good. Sir, I am Shishpal from, from Palampur, Himachal
Thank you
Pradesh.
for that.
Sir, we have gone through Shakespearean times, and we have seen that plague has really marred the theater. Theaters were shut down in London during those times. If we go to pre-Shakespearean times also, we see that in Chaucer's times also,
So will you repeat that bit, that last line that
sir,
you
in
spoke?
Shakespeare's time,
I-
theaters
The
were
theatres were
closed
closed
down,
down off
shut
and on,
down
yes.
in London in those
Mm,
times. And similarly, we see in Chaucer's
mm.
times too, there was a plague, and victims, the people were victims of poverty, squalor, and pestilence. Even well-educated nobles, they eyed soap with suspicion, and learned physicians often forbade bathing as harmful for health, as it is almost written in various books. So England was described that that's why there were epidemics in England, especially plague. And the severest attack of this dread epidemic came in 1348. It was called the Black Death because black naughty boils appeared on the bodies of the hopeless victims. So I want to ask you, sir, has that really marred the potential of writing in pre-Shakespearean times too?
Sorry, please repeat that
Has
question.
that
Has that
marred the potential of writing in the pre-Shakespeare, yeah, MARRED,
marred?
yeah, marred
Marred.
potential of writing
Yes, yes.
in the pre-Shakespearean times, in Chaucer's times too?
I never suggested that the plague
Yeah,
marred the quality of writing, even in Shakespeare's time. It only produced a certain kind of writing. And I said that references to the plague, in any case, are very scanty in Shakespeare and Shakespeare's contemporaries. Now, if you're talking of pre-Shakespearean literature, or literature written between 1348, which was roughly the time of the onset of the Black Death, and the 1590s when Shakespeare begins to write, um, I'm not sure that the Black Death or the other plagues that followed could really be thought of as marring or coming in the way of good literature, good literary writing. Literature flourished, and you have Chaucer's works, and if you read Chaucer, do you get indications that Chaucer was hampered in any way by the plague, in the sense that he could have written better had there been no Black Death? I mean, we're not really left with that impression, are we, when we read the literature of the late Middle Ages or the early Renaissance? I don't think that's right. I don't think that's right. I mean, the plague was deadly. The Black Death, of course, terrible. But I don't think it got too much in the way of the literary endeavors of writers, other than, of course, the fact that when drama became a very important means of social entertainment, and theatre was built in 1576, and the other big public playhouses came up on the outskirts of London, they had to be closed down because they could be the breeding grounds of not only plagues but also a number of other diseases. For example, these playhouses were close to the Thames, and the banks of the Thames had marshes and swamps which could breed all kinds of pests that could lead to diseases, mosquitoes, for example. But otherwise, I don't think, I mean, literature was marred by. Marred, I think, is too strong a word to use if you're thinking of the kind of influence that the plague had on literature.
Is there any other question from anyone?
Hello. Am I
Yes.
audible, sir?
Yes, you're audible.
Sir, I'm Cecilia. I'm very highly thankful for being here. I have one question, sir. It's been claimed that many modern writers have already predicted this COVID-19 in literature.
Can you be a little louder, please?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, it's been claimed that many modern writers have predicted already this COVID-19 in their writing, like Sylvia Brown and Dean Koontz. So, same pandemics have been occurred already, like you mentioned 1348, Plague, Black Death, and others. So, was there any writer who predicted these all plagues earlier than occurrence?
Who predicted the plague? Sorry, the last few words.
Sir, was there any writer who predicted these plagues before this occurrence?
Before the Black Death came along?
Yes.
Is that
yes,
what you
yes.
mean?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
No, I'm not very sure. I'm not very sure that there was a prediction that there would be this Black Death. I'm not sure. I don't know that. But of course, I'll try to find out now that you've raised the question. I'm not sure of predictions. No.
Okay, I think there is no more question. So
But once the plague came, there was no end to curses which people would heap on those that they didn't like, or those who were their enemies. And very often, the plague became part of the vocabulary of cursing. All right, as in King Lear, for example, that's a literary text. But then, even in regular life, outside literature, the plague was often invoked in curses.
We have, sir, I think there is no more question. So now we are going to end today's session. Please give us leave, and thank you very much, sir.
Yes, thank you, Sourav, for being part of the organizing committee.
Thank you,
And
sir.
thank you, a big thank you to all those who stayed back to listen and ask questions. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
And thank you, Amit sir, for attending the web lecture. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Amrit, and thank you, everyone else, students and colleagues who asked those questions and made me think about the answers to give you.
So let us call it a day and give us leave. Tomorrow the session will start at 12. So till then, goodbye. Goodbye to everyone. Thank you, sir.